My grandfather always told me there were secrets buried in this soil. 4 generations of my family have worked this land, but nothing prepared me for what I found locked away in that old concrete bunker from the Great Depression. I broke open a vault that had been sealed for nearly a century, and what grew from those forgotten seeds didn't just save my farm. It challenged everything modern agriculture thought was possible. And then the corporations came, determined to bury my discovery as deeply as those seeds had once been buried. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. It all started last spring, during the worst drought Cedar County had seen in 50 years. I'm Thomas Reeves, 3rd-generation farmer on this 80-acre plot my great-grandfather staked during the Homestead Act. These days, small family farms, like mine, are becoming endangered species, squeezed between mega-farms and encroaching development. That April, I was facing the real possibility of losing everything. 3 straight years of unpredictable weather had depleted my financial reserves. The bank was making noise about my mortgage, and Agricon Industries, the agricultural conglomerate that had been buying up all the struggling farms in the area, was circling like vultures. The irony wasn't lost on me that my farm was failing, despite being situated on what was once the most fertile soil in the state. My grandfather used to tell stories about how this land could grow anything. Corn stalks so tall you needed a ladder to reach the top ears, tomatoes the size of softballs, and wheat fields that rippled like a golden ocean. Those stories seemed like fairy tales now, as I looked out at my struggling crops. Decades of modern farming practices had slowly stripped the land of its natural vitality. The soil that once supported my grandparents through the Dust Bowl now seemed exhausted, barely responsive even to the expensive fertilizers I could scarcely afford. Each season required more inputs for diminishing returns. It was a treadmill I couldn't outrun much longer. My neighbor Earl Jenkins had already surrendered to the inevitable. Just last month, I'd watched him sign the papers selling his family's century farm to Agricon. "You can't fight progress, Tommy," he'd told me with resignation in his voice. "Farming ain't what it used to be. It's all science and scale now." Maybe he was right. Maybe small farmers like us were just relics, stubbornly clinging to an outdated way of life. But every time I thought about selling, I could almost hear my grandfather's voice. "This land doesn't just grow crops, Tommy. It grows people. It grows character." I was desperate for solutions. The forecast predicted another 3 months without significant rainfall, and my irrigation pond was already dangerously low. The seed catalogs offered drought-resistant hybrid varieties, but the prices were astronomical, and they required proprietary fertilizers and pesticides sold by the same companies. It was another debt trap I couldn't afford to fall into. Something had to change, or this would be the last season the Reeves family worked this land. That's when I remembered my grandfather's stories about the rainy day insurance his father had created during the Great Depression. As a child, I'd assumed it was just another tall tale, like the one about the catfish as big as a canoe in Miller's Creek. Grandpa Joe would describe how his father, my great-grandfather Samuel Reeves, had been obsessed with preserving the old ways of farming. The old man was convinced the world was going to forget how to grow real food, Grandpa would say, always squirreling away seeds and writing down everything in those journals of his. After the Dust Bowl, when industrial agriculture began transforming American farming, Samuel had apparently become even more determined to preserve traditional methods. According to family law, he'd created some kind of repository of seeds and agricultural knowledge, hidden somewhere on the property. With nothing to lose, I decided to see if there was any truth to these stories. I spent days combing through the old barn, finding nothing but rusty tools and mouse nests. I checked the root cellar, the attic of the farmhouse, even the old well house. Nothing. Finally, I found myself in the far corner of our property, at the site of the original homestead, where only the foundation stones remained. It was an area we rarely visited anymore, too rocky for crops and too far from the main house to be convenient for anything else. My grandfather had always said his father was a cautious man, traumatized by the hunger he'd witnessed in the 1930s. Never again, he'd vowed. As I cleared away decades of underbrush, I tried to think like a man determined to protect his knowledge from time itself. Behind thick overgrowth, I uncovered something I'd never noticed before, a small concrete structure almost completely reclaimed by nature. Unlike the limestone foundation stones of the old homestead, this was poured concrete, unusual for rural construction in that era. The small building was approximately 8 feet square, with no windows and a single metal door, now rusted and partly covered by soil and roots. The padlock was so corroded, it crumbled in my hands when I tried. To open it, it took me hours with a pry bar to break through the rusted metal door. The hinges finally gave way with a groan that seemed to echo across generations. The air inside was surprisingly dry and cool. As I shined my flashlight through the darkness, I could make out wooden shelving lining 3 walls, holding dozens of carefully arranged glass jars and metal containers. Each was meticulously labeled in fading handwriting. A small desk stood against the 4th wall, its surface covered with stacked notebooks bound in leather. Mortgage lifter tomato, 1931 harvest, read one label. Nebraska wedding tomato, 1929 read another. Grandpa Ott's morning glory, 1932 said a third. Some names I recognized from Grandpa's stories, while others were completely foreign to me. Blue Hubbard squash, German pink potato, moon and stars watermelon, painted mountain corn. A leather-bound journal lay prominently on the desk, its pages filled with my great-grandfather's meticulous handwriting. The date on the first entry, October 17th, 1932. For my children's children, it began. When the world forgets how to grow food without chemicals, these seeds will remember. What I'd found wasn't just seed storage, it was a deliberate time capsule of agricultural wisdom, preserved by a man who feared future generations might lose connection with traditional farming knowledge. My great-grandfather had collected and preserved hundreds of heirloom seed varieties, many of which I didn't recognize, along with detailed instructions for cultivation methods now considered obsolete. The journals detailed companion planting techniques, natural pest control methods, soil building practices, and weather forecasting approaches that relied on observation rather than technology. It was a comprehensive system of farming that required no chemical inputs, a complete alternative to the methods I'd been taught in agricultural college. As I carefully gathered a selection of seeds and journals to take back to the farmhouse, a fragile hope began to take root. Perhaps these forgotten methods could succeed where modern approaches were failing me. What if my great-grandfather's foresight could be the key to saving the farm? As I held those dusty jars in my hands, I had no idea that these forgotten seeds would not only save my farm, but would soon make me the target of one of the most powerful corporations in modern agriculture, a company that had spent billions ensuring these old varieties and methods stayed buried in the past. That night, I stayed up until dawn, reading through my great-grandfather's journals. His handwriting, precise and slanted, filled page after page with agricultural wisdom that had been all but forgotten in the modern era. He detailed how certain plants supported each other when grown together, corn providing stalks for beans to climb while beans fixed nitrogen in the soil to feed the corn. He described natural pest deterrents, soil amendments using only materials found on the farm, and methods for saving seeds that would grow true year after year. What struck me most was how his methods formed a complete system, each element supporting another in a continuous cycle that required no outside inputs. It was farming as my ancestors had practiced it, before chemical fertilizers and patented seeds became the norm. By morning I had made my decision. I would dedicate 5 acres, all I could risk, to an experiment with these heirloom seeds and methods. If they failed, I'd be that much closer to losing the farm. But if they succeeded, well, I couldn't afford not to try. Over the next week, I prepared the soil according to my great-grandfather's instructions. Instead of the usual tilling and chemical treatments, I used techniques he called sheet composting and green manuring. The methods were labor-intensive, but required almost no cash outlay, a significant advantage given my financial situation. When planting day arrived, I found myself handling each seed with reverence. These weren't just plants. They were living connections to my family's past, seeds my great-grandfather had saved during the darkest days of the Depression, seeds that had lain dormant for nearly 90 years, waiting for their moment to grow again. I was halfway through planting when a sleek black SUV pulled up my driveway. A woman in an impeccably tailored suit stepped out, surveying my modest farmhouse with barely concealed disdain. She approached with the confident stride of someone accustomed to getting her way. "Mr. Reeves, I'm Dr. Eliza Montgomery, Director of Acquisitions for Agricon Industries." She extended a manicured hand, which I reluctantly shook with my soil-covered one. "I was hoping we might have a conversation about your property." I invited her in, more out of ingrained hospitality than any desire to hear Agricon's sales pitch. Inside, she declined my offer of coffee and got straight to business. "Mr. Reeves, I'll be direct. Agricon is interested in purchasing your farm. As part of our Cedar County consolidation initiative, we've acquired 17 properties in this area already, including the Jenkins farm next door." She slid a document across my kitchen table. "This is our initial offer. As you can see, it's quite generous, 20% above current market value. We're prepared to assume all outstanding debts and allow you to remain in the residence for up to 6 months while you arrange new accommodations." I glanced at the figure. It was indeed substantial, enough to clear my debts and start fresh somewhere else. Perhaps even enough to buy a smaller property where I could live without the constant financial pressure. "Why are you so interested in this area?" I asked, buying time to process the offer. Dr. Montgomery's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Cedar County has ideal soil composition and climate for our new proprietary corn and soybean varieties. We're developing this region as a showcase for Agricon's integrated agricultural systems, seed to table, all under optimized management. And what happens to the farms you buy? We implement our efficiency protocols. The smaller parcels are consolidated, outdated structures removed, and operations modernized with our precision agriculture systems." She gestured out the window toward what had once been the Jenkins family home, now demolished to make way for more cropland. "It's progress. Mr. Reeves, the future of farming." I noticed her gaze shift to my kitchen counter, where several of the seed jars from the vault sat alongside my great-grandfather's journal. Her expression changed almost imperceptibly. A slight narrowing of the eyes, a tightening around the mouth. "What interesting artifacts," she said, moving closer to examine them. "Family heirlooms?" "Something like that," I replied, suddenly uncomfortable with her interest. "Old seeds my great-grandfather saved." Dr. Montgomery picked up one of the jars, studying the label. "Gaspé Flint corn, 1934. How fascinating. These look like heritage varieties. You know, Agricon has an extensive seed preservation program. We collect historical specimens for our genetic library." She set down the jar with deliberate care. "If you have a collection of pre-war heirloom seeds, that could actually enhance the value of our offer. We're always looking to expand our genetic resources for future breeding programs. There was something in her tone, a calculated interest that felt predatory rather than preservationist. I found myself moving between her and the seed jars. "I'll consider your offer," I said, hoping to end the conversation. "Of course." She handed me her business card. "Take some time to think it through. But I should mention that our offer is time-sensitive. We're moving quickly to complete acquisitions in this phase of the project." As she turned to leave, she paused at the door. "One more thing, Mr. Reeves. Those heritage seeds, while historically interesting, they're not suitable for modern agriculture. Yield rates, disease resistance, uniformity, they simply can't compete with today's varieties. I wouldn't waste valuable land trying to grow them. Just friendly advice from someone who's studied agricultural science her entire career." After she left, I stood in my kitchen, staring at the offer document. The amount was tempting, a clean escape from my financial troubles. But something about Dr. Montgomery's interest in my great-grandfather's seeds bothered me. Why would a massive corporation like Agricon care about a few old seed varieties? My suspicions deepened the following day when I received an unexpected visitor, Harold Schmidt, an elderly farmer from the next county over. He arrived in a rusted pickup truck, moving with the deliberate pace of someone who'd spent decades working the land. "Heard you found some old seeds," he said after introducing himself. "Word travels fast around here." I was immediately wary. "Where'd you hear that?" "From Bill Tucker at the feed store. Said he saw you carrying some old glass jars with seeds." Got me curious. Not many folks interested in the old varieties these days. Something in his weathered face made me trust him. I invited him to see the 5 acres I'd planted with my great-grandfather's seeds. As we walked the rows of newly turned earth with tiny green sprouts just beginning to emerge, Harold grew increasingly animated. "I haven't seen some of these varieties since I was a boy on my daddy's farm," he said, kneeling with effort to examine a seedling. "This here's Moon and Stars watermelon. And over there, that's glass gem corn starting to come up." He straightened, looking at me with newfound respect. "Where'd you get these seeds, son?" Most of these varieties were pushed out of commercial farming 50, 60 years ago, when the big companies started promoting their hybrids. I told him about finding my great-grandfather's vault. As I spoke, Harold nodded with understanding. "Your great-granddaddy was a wise man. These aren't just old seeds, they're agricultural treasures." He gestured toward the green shoots. "These plants know how to grow without chemicals. They've developed natural resistances over generations of adaptation. And most importantly, they produce seeds you can save and plant again next year. Unlike the patented varieties from companies like Agricon," I said, beginning to understand. "Exactly. The big ag corporations have spent decades making farmers dependent on their products, seeds that won't grow true if saved, requiring their specific fertilizers and pesticides, all patented and proprietary." Harold's eyes narrowed. "They call it progress, but it's really about control. Agricon offered to buy my farm yesterday," I told him. "Their representative seemed very interested." "In these seeds?" Harold's expression grew serious. "I'm not surprised. Companies like Agricon have been systematically buying up and restricting access to heritage seed varieties for years. They acquire the intellectual property rights, then shelve the varieties that don't fit their business model, especially the open-pollinated ones that farmers can propagate themselves." He looked across my fields with concern. "If they know you have viable pre-war seeds that can grow without their chemicals, they'll either want to own them or make sure no one else can access them. These old varieties represent freedom from their system, something they've spent billions to eliminate." As Harold's pickup disappeared down my driveway later that afternoon, I felt a growing sense of unease. What I'd thought was simply a family heirloom, a curiosity from the past, was apparently something much more significant. Something worth protecting. That evening, I received an email from Dr. Montgomery. Agricon was increasing their offer by 15%. with an added stipulation: all agricultural materials and historical specimens on the property would become Agricon's intellectual property. The email emphasized the time-sensitive nature of the offer, with a deadline of just 10 days for my response. I sat on my porch, watching the sunset cast long shadows across my fields, across the tender green shoots that represented both my past and possibly my future. In the distance, I could see the Jenkins property, now flattened and uniform, awaiting Agricon's machinery. The contrast with my experimentally planted 5 acres couldn't have been starker. Something was happening with those heirloom plantings that I couldn't yet explain. Just 7 days after planting, the seedlings were already more vigorous than I would have expected, especially in drought conditions. They seemed to be thriving in soil that had been struggling to support modern varieties. As darkness fell, I made my decision. I wouldn't sell, not yet at least. I needed to see what these forgotten plants from the past could do, what knowledge they might hold. If my great-grandfather had gone to such lengths to preserve them, he must have believed they contained something valuable, something worth protecting for future generations. What I didn't realize then was that my decision would not only put me on a collision course with one of the most powerful corporations in the world, but would also unearth agricultural secrets that would challenge the very foundations of modern farming. Secrets that some would go to extraordinary lengths to keep buried. Over the next 3 weeks, something remarkable happened in those 5 acres planted with my great-grandfather's seeds. While my conventional fields struggled in the continuing drought, the heirloom plants thrived. They grew faster, stronger, and seemed almost impervious to the pests that plagued neighboring farms. I followed the companion planting methods detailed in the journals, interplanting corn with beans and squash, surrounding tomatoes with marigolds, using strategic plantings of aromatic herbs to confuse insect pests. The results defied everything I'd learned in agricultural college. Plants that should have required irrigation were drawing sufficient moisture from the morning dew and the increasingly healthy soil. Varieties that had been deemed obsolete because of their supposed susceptibility to disease showed remarkable resilience. The soil itself was changing, becoming darker, richer, more alive with earthworms and beneficial insects. By early June, word of my unusual crops had spread throughout Cedar County. Local farmers began stopping by, curious about the vibrant growth visible from the road. Even in the grip of drought, my 5 experimental acres stood in stark contrast to the struggling conventional fields, both mine and those of my neighbors. Dr. Montgomery returned exactly 1 day after her offer deadline passed. This time, she brought company, a man she introduced as Dr. James Wilson, Agricon's chief research officer, and 2 younger assistants who remained by the SUV, taking photos of my fields with professional cameras equipped with telephoto lenses. "Mr. Reeves," Dr. Montgomery began, her smile tight, "I was disappointed not to hear from you regarding our offer." "I'm still considering my options," I replied, watching Dr. Wilson as he stared intently at my experimental fields. "Those are the heritage plantings?" he asked, not waiting for an introduction. "The ones using pre-war seed stock?" I nodded, increasingly uncomfortable with their interest. "Remarkable vigor," he muttered, almost to himself. "Drought conditions for nearly 5 weeks, yet the phenotypic expression suggests optimal hydration." Dr. Montgomery cleared her throat. "Mr. Reeves, we'd like to revise our offer. Agricon is prepared to increase the purchase price by an additional 30% with immediate cash payment." The new figure she named was staggering, nearly double what my farm was worth on paper. It was enough money to buy a new farm elsewhere, with plenty left over for equipment and operating costs. "That's very generous," I said carefully. "May I ask what's changed to justify such an increase?" Dr. Wilson stepped forward. Your experimental crops have caught our attention, Mr. Reeves. Agricon is always interested in genetic diversity for our breeding programs. The pre-war varieties you're growing represent potentially valuable germplasm. You want my great-grandfather's seeds, I said, the realization dawning. We want to bring their beneficial traits into modern agriculture, Dr. Wilson corrected. Your heirloom varieties lack the uniformity and yield potential of contemporary cultivars, but they clearly possess drought tolerance and pest resistance characteristics that could be valuable. Agricon can isolate these traits and incorporate them into our commercial varieties. And what happens to the original varieties? Dr. Wilson and Dr. Montgomery exchanged glances. That would depend on their commercial viability, Dr. Montgomery said smoothly. Many heritage varieties can't meet modern agricultural standards for uniformity and processing compatibility. Meaning you'd shelve them, I translated. Lock them away in your corporate seed vault. Dr. Wilson frowned. Mr. Reeves, I don't think you understand the economics of modern agriculture. These old varieties might have certain beneficial traits, but they're fundamentally incompatible with large-scale farming. They can't be machine-harvested efficiently. They don't ship well. Their yield statistics are unpredictable. Yet they're growing better than anything else in a drought, I pointed out. A statistical anomaly, Dr. Wilson dismissed. We'd need to run controlled trials over multiple seasons to determine if there's actually a drought tolerance trait worth isolating. I gestured toward my fields. This isn't a statistical anomaly. These plants are thriving while everything around them struggles. And they're doing it without chemical fertilizers, without pesticides, without irrigation. Dr. Montgomery stepped in, her voice soothing. Which is precisely why Agricon is interested, Mr. Reeves. Imagine if we could bring that drought tolerance to modern high-yield varieties. It could revolutionize agriculture in arid regions worldwide. By extracting specific traits and patenting them, I said. While the original varieties, the ones farmers could grow and save seeds from themselves, remain locked away. That's a rather cynical view of agricultural innovation, Dr. Montgomery replied, her patience visibly wearing thin. Perhaps, I conceded, but I'm not selling, not my farm and not my great-grandfather's seeds. Dr. Wilson shook his head. You're making a mistake. These old varieties might seem impressive in your small test plot, but they'll never compete economically with modern agriculture. Agricon is offering you a chance to contribute to real progress while being generously compensated. I appreciate the offer, I said firmly, but my decision is final. As they turned to leave, Dr. Montgomery paused. One last thing, Mr. Reeves. Those seeds your great-grandfather saved, have you considered their legal status prior to the plant? Patent Act of 1930, seed saving was unregulated, but many of those old varieties were later patented by various entities. Agricon has acquired many of those patents through corporate acquisitions. The threat was thinly veiled. Are you suggesting my great-grandfather's seeds might belong to Agricon? I'm merely pointing out that agricultural intellectual property is a complex area. It would be unfortunate if your experiment encountered legal complications. She handed me her card again. My offer remains open for 72 hours. I suggest you reconsider. After they left, I called Harold Schmidt. His response to my account of the meeting was immediate and alarming. They're scared, he said bluntly. You've stumbled onto something they've spent decades and billions of dollars suppressing. The fact that farming doesn't need their patented seeds, their chemical inputs, or their technological control systems. What should I do? Document everything, Harold advised. Take daily photos of your crops, keep meticulous records of growth rates, water usage, pest resistance, and most importantly, start connecting with other farmers who might be interested in these methods. Strength in numbers. Son, following Harold's advice, I began inviting local farmers to see the results for themselves. Most came out of curiosity, skeptical of my claims about drought-resistant heritage crops. They left shaking their heads in amazement. Martin Ramirez, who farmed 200 acres of conventional corn, ran his hands through the soil in my experimental plot, marveling at its texture and moisture content. "I haven't seen soil this healthy in 30 years, he said. "It's like the ground on my grandfather's farm, before we started with the heavy chemical applications." Sarah Johnson, one of the few organic farmers in the county, examined the complex interplanting system with an expert's eye. "This isn't just old varieties, it's old wisdom," she observed. "The way these plants support each other. It's a relationship, not just a crop." By mid-June, I had a steady stream of visitors. Some were merely curious, but others were genuinely interested in the agricultural system my great-grandfather had preserved. I began sharing small samples of seeds with farmers I trusted, along with copies of the relevant sections from the journals. It felt like the right thing to do. Knowledge meant to be preserved should also be shared. Exactly 72 hours after Dr. Montgomery's deadline, I received a certified letter from Agricon's legal department. It claimed that preliminary genetic analysis of plant material collected from my property without my permission, I noted, showed similarities to proprietary Agricon germplasm. The letter demanded I cease cultivation of the unauthorized varieties and surrender all seed stock for verification of ownership. The legal language was intimidating, full of references to patent infringement and statutory damages. But the core claim was absurd. How could century-old seeds infringe on modern patents? It was clearly a pressure tactic meant to frighten me into compliance. Instead of being intimidated, I felt a renewed determination. If Agricon was willing to make such transparently false legal claims, it suggested they were genuinely worried about what my great-grandfather's seeds represented. The question was, why? What was it about these heritage crops that threatened a multinational corporation with billions in annual revenue? The answer began to emerge the following week, when the first of my experimental tomato plants ripened. The fruits were irregular by modern standards. Not the uniform spheres favored by supermarkets, but deeply lobed, multi-chambered fruits in shades ranging from deep crimson to purple-black. When I sliced one open, the aroma was intoxicating, rich and complex in a way that modern tomatoes simply weren't. The flavor was a revelation, sweet, tangy, with layers of complexity I'd never experienced in a commercially grown tomato. I brought samples to the farmers' market that Saturday, offering tastings to anyone interested. The response was immediate and enthusiastic. People wanted to know where they could buy these tomatoes, whether I had plants for sale, if I would be growing more varieties. By the end of the day, I'd sold out of everything I'd brought and had a list of customers wanting regular deliveries. For the first time in years, I returned from the market with more money than I'd anticipated, and, more importantly, with a glimpse of a possible future for my farm that didn't involve selling to Agricon. When I arrived home, there was an unfamiliar truck parked in my driveway. A middle-aged woman with a no-nonsense demeanor introduced herself as Rebecca Torres, head chef at Harvest Table, one of the most acclaimed farm-to-table restaurants in the state. "I tasted your tomatoes at the market today," she said without preamble. "I need to know if you have more varieties like that and how much acreage you're planning for next season." Our conversation lasted well into the evening, covering my great-grandfather's seed vault, the growing methods detailed in his journals, and the remarkable results I was seeing. By the time she left, we had a handshake agreement. If my other heritage vegetables matched the quality of the tomatoes, Harvest Table would commit to purchasing a significant portion of my crop at premium prices next season. For the first time since finding the seed vault, I allowed myself to feel genuine hope. There might be a viable path forward, not competing with industrial agriculture on its terms, but creating an alternative model based on exceptional quality, unique varieties, and sustainable methods. What I didn't realize was that this success, modest as it was, would trigger Agricon's next move, one that would make their legal threats seem tame by comparison. The battle for my great-grandfather's agricultural legacy was just beginning, and the stakes were about to become much higher than I could have imagined. The transformation of my experimental plot accelerated as summer progressed. The heritage corn reached heights I'd never seen in modern varieties, with stalks thick as my wrist and multiple ears forming on each plant. The squash plants sprawled exuberantly, their broad leaves shading the soil and suppressing weeds, while their tendrils climbed the cornstalks. Bean plants twisted upward alongside the corn, their nitrogen-fixing roots feeding the entire system. It was agriculture as a symphony rather than a monoculture, each plant playing its role in a complex, mutually supportive arrangement. And the results were becoming impossible to ignore. By early July, the contrast between my experimental acres and the rest of the farm was stark enough to be visible from the county road. My conventional fields, planted with modern hybrid corn, showed the stress of the ongoing drought, leaves curling, growth stunted, with irrigation providing only minimal relief. Meanwhile, the heritage varieties flourished without a drop of irrigation water, drawing what they needed from the increasingly healthy soil and from each other. The farm had become something of a local attraction. Farmers, gardeners, and the simply curious arrived daily, wanting to see for themselves what they'd heard about. I began offering informal tours, explaining my great-grandfather's methods and showing the results. Many visitors left shaking their heads in disbelief. Some left with small samples of seeds and photocopied pages from the journals. Among my visitors was Professor Laura Chen from the State Agricultural University. She arrived unannounced one Tuesday morning, introduced herself as an agronomist, specializing in sustainable farming systems, and asked to see my experimental fields. As we walked the rows of thriving crops, her professional reserve gradually gave way to undisguised excitement. She took soil samples, measured plant growth, and photographed the intricate relationships between different species. "This intercropping system is remarkable," she said, examining how the bean plants interacted with the corn. "Some of these methods disappeared from mainstream agriculture so long ago that they've been essentially forgotten by modern science. Yet the results speak for themselves." She was particularly interested in the soil. "The microbial activity here is off the charts," she observed, crumbling a handful of rich, dark earth between her fingers. "You've created a self-sustaining ecosystem in just a few months." "My great-grandfather created it," I corrected her. "I'm just following his instructions." Professor Chen spent hours documenting the fields, asking detailed questions about the age methods described in the journals. As she prepared to leave, she made an unexpected proposal. "Mr. Reeves, I'd like to establish a formal research partnership between you and the university. We could help document these methods scientifically, compare results with conventional approaches, and potentially develop a modern framework for implementing these traditional techniques at scale." The offer was tempting. University backing would provide resources and scientific credibility I couldn't achieve on my own. But something held me back. "Before I agree to anything," I said carefully, "I need to know who funds your departments." "Research." Professor Chen's slight hesitation told me everything. "We have various funding sources, including several agricultural technology companies, including Agricon." Her discomfort was visible. "Agricon is one of our major corporate partners, yes, but I can assure you our research maintains scientific independence." I explained my interactions with Agricon, including their increasingly aggressive attempts to acquire my farm and the heritage seeds. Professor Chen listened with growing concern. "I had no idea," she said when I finished. "This puts me in a difficult position. Professionally, I'm obligated to report significant agricultural innovations to my department, but I understand your concerns about corporate co-option of these methods." We reached a compromise. Professor Chen would conduct preliminary research independently, outside her official university duties, documenting the performance of the heritage crops without involving her department or its corporate sponsors. In exchange, I would provide detailed records of my growing methods and results. "What you've rediscovered here deserves proper scientific documentation," she said as she left. "These methods could help address some of our most pressing agricultural challenges: drought, soil degradation, chemical dependency. They shouldn't be locked away in a corporate seed vault." Her words reinforced what I was beginning to understand. My great-grandfather's seeds represented more than just an alternative approach to farming. They were living proof that the industrial agricultural model, with its dependence on chemical inputs, irrigation, and patented seeds, wasn't the only way to feed the world. For companies like Agricon, whose entire business model depended on farmer dependency, that was a dangerous idea indeed. The following week brought unexpected support from another quarter. Margot Williams, food editor for the regional newspaper, arrived to write a story about my heritage tomatoes, which had developed something of a cult following at the farmers' market. Her simple feature story about forgotten flavors unexpectedly went viral online, bringing attention from foodie blogs, sustainability advocates, and even national media outlets. Suddenly, I was fielding calls from journalists wanting the seed vault story, most focused on the human interest angle, the connection across generations, the preservation of agricultural heritage, the superior flavor of the resulting produce. But a few dug deeper, exploring the implications for modern agriculture and food security. One investigative reporter, Nathan Collins, from an environmental news site, spent 2 days at the farm, meticulously documenting the differences between my conventional fields and the heritage plot. His resulting article, "The Seeds Corporations Don't Want You to Plant," explicitly connected Agricon's interest in my farm to broader patterns of agricultural consolidation and control. Companies like Agricon have spent decades and billions of dollars convincing farmers and policymakers that their model, patented seeds, chemical inputs, technological dependence, is the only viable approach to modern agriculture, Collins wrote. Thomas Reeves's experimental field, growing vigorously during a severe drought without irrigation or chemical inputs, challenges that narrative at its foundation. The article included quotes from agricultural economists, food sovereignty advocates, and farmers who had transitioned away from conventional methods. It presented a compelling case that the industrial agricultural system wasn't designed primarily for efficiency or productivity, but for corporate control of the food system. 3 days after the article was published, I received a call from Sofia Garcia, founder of the Seed Sovereignty Alliance, a national organization dedicated to preserving agricultural biodiversity and farmers' rights to save and share seeds. "Your great-grandfather did something extraordinary," Sophia told me. "Not just saving those seeds, but preserving the knowledge of how to grow them successfully. We'd like to help ensure that legacy isn't lost or locked away." She explained that the Alliance could provide legal support if Agricon pursued their dubious patent claims, connections to markets interested in heritage crops, and most importantly, a network of farmers committed to preserving and expanding seed diversity. "What you found isn't just your family's heritage. It's part of our collective agricultural heritage," Sophia emphasized. Seeds that were developed by generations of farmers, adapted to local conditions, and freely shared, until corporations began patenting them and restricting their use. The Alliance offered to help document and preserve my great-grandfather's seeds through their community seed bank network, ensuring they would remain available to farmers regardless of what happened to my individual farm. They also connected me with their legal team, who reviewed Agricon's cease and desist letter and pronounced it corporate intimidation with minimal legal foundation. Pre-1930 varieties can't be retroactively claimed under patent law, explained Marco Rodriguez, the Alliance's chief legal counsel. And genetic similarity to modern patented varieties could just as easily indicate that Agricon incorporated heritage genetics into their proprietary lines, not the other way around. With the Alliance's backing, I felt confident enough to formally reject Agricon's demands. My response letter, drafted with Marco's help, not only refused to cease cultivation, but explicitly asserted my right to grow, save, and share seeds from my great-grandfather's collection as part of America's agricultural heritage. The support network forming around my farm and the heritage seeds gave me courage. Professor Chen's scientific documentation, the media attention generated by Colin's article, and the Seed Sovereignty Alliance's legal and practical assistance created a protective framework that would make it harder for Agricon to simply bully me into submission. But as July turned to August and my experimental crops continued to thrive despite the worsening drought, Agricon's tactics shifted from legal pressure to something more insidious. The battle for control of my great-grandfather's agricultural legacy was entering a new and more dangerous phase, one that would soon threaten not just my farm's future, but the safety of the seeds themselves. The first sign of Agricon's new approach came when Dr. Montgomery appeared at the farmer's market where I was selling my heritage tomatoes and early sweet corn. She moved through the crowd with calculated casualness, stopping at my stand as if by chance. "Impressive produce, Mr. Reeves," she said, examining a particularly large Cherokee purple tomato, especially considering the drought conditions. I acknowledged her with a nod, continuing to serve the customers lined up at my stand. The heritage vegetables had developed such a following that I now sold out within the first hour of the market. Dr. Montgomery waited until the crowd thinned before speaking again. "I'm not here to pressure you, just to observe. Fascinating how these antiquated varieties are attracting such interest. Quaint, really, like vintage clothing or antique furniture, a novelty in our modern agricultural system." "They're more than a novelty," I replied, gesturing to my empty stand. "People are rediscovering what real food tastes like." "A luxury market," she conceded with a dismissive wave. "Affluent consumers willing to pay premium prices for perceived quality differences, but hardly a viable model for feeding the world." Before I could respond, Rebecca Torres, the chef who had become one of my most vocal supporters, approached my stand. She recognized Dr. Montgomery immediately. "Agricon, right?" Rebecca said coolly. "I remember you from the Sustainable Food Conference last year. You were arguing that heritage varieties couldn't meet commercial kitchen standards." Dr. Montgomery smiled thinly. "Chef Torres, yes. I recall presenting data on consistency and yield factors in commercial agriculture." Rebecca picked up one of my remaining tomatoes. "I've built my restaurant's reputation on produce like this. Customers drive hours for my heritage tomato tasting menu. Thomas's vegetables have transformed my business." "A charming success story," Dr. Montgomery replied, "but limited in scale and relevance to global food systems." "That's where you're wrong," Rebecca countered. "Chefs across the country are creating similar relationships with farmers growing these forgotten varieties. It's not just about flavor, it's about resilience. While conventional farms are struggling with drought, Thomas's heritage crops are thriving. That should interest a seed company, shouldn't it?" Dr. Montgomery's composure slipped momentarily. "Agricon invests millions in drought resistance research. Anecdotal success with obsolete varieties on a single farm hardly constitutes a scalable solution." The conversation might have escalated further, but we were interrupted by Martin Ramirez, who had become one of my most enthusiastic converts after seeing my experimental fields. He arrived at my stand with exciting news. The test plot, where he'd planted some of my great-grandfather's corn, was showing remarkable drought tolerance, just like mine. The corn from Thomas's seeds is growing strong with half the irrigation my regular fields need, Martin told Rebecca excitedly, not noticing Dr. Montgomery. I'm expanding to 20 acres next season. Dr. Montgomery observed this exchange with a calculating expression before excusing herself. As she walked away, Rebecca turned to me with concern. Be careful, Thomas. Companies like Agricon don't like threats to their business model. And your seeds represent exactly that. Proof that farmers don't need their patented products to succeed. Her warning stayed with me as I drove home that afternoon. The market had been another success, financially and in terms of building support for heritage agriculture. But Dr. Montgomery's appearance suggested Agricon hadn't given up their pursuit. My suspicions were confirmed the next morning when I discovered someone had been on my property overnight. The lock on my equipment shed had been forced, though nothing appeared to be missing. More alarmingly, several sections of the experimental field showed signs of disturbance. Plants examined, soil samples taken. I called the county sheriff, who sent Deputy Garcia to take a report. She was sympathetic, but not optimistic about finding the perpetrators. No security cameras out here, I'm guessing? She asked, surveying the remote location. I shook my head. Like most farmers, I'd never needed surveillance equipment before. Any idea what they were looking for? She continued, noting the apparently targeted nature of the intrusion, focused on the experimental fields rather than more valuable equipment or my home. Information, I said grimly. They wanted to see exactly what I'm growing and how I'm growing it. Deputy Garcia raised an eyebrow. They? I explained my ongoing conflict with Agricon, their interest in my great-grandfather's seeds, and their escalating pressure tactics. She listened attentively, but I could tell she was skeptical about a multinational corporation resorting to trespassing. I'll file the report, she promised. But without evidence linking Agricon to the break-in, there's not much we can do. After she left, I called Harold Schmidt and described what had happened. His response was immediate and alarming. They're escalating, he said gravely. First legal threats, now information gathering. The next step could be direct action against your crops or seed supply. What kind of direct action? I asked, though I feared I knew the answer. Contamination, sabotage. It's happened before with farmers who challenged big ag companies. Experimental fields mysteriously destroyed. Seed supplies compromised. You need to protect what you have, Thomas, especially the original seed vault. Harold's warning galvanized me into action. I couldn't afford an elaborate security system, but I could take basic precautions. I installed motion-activated game, cameras around the perimeter of my property, and particularly near the experimental fields. I changed the locks on all outbuildings. Most importantly, I secured my great-grandfather's seed vault. The concrete bunker had remained untouched since my discovery, still containing most of the original seed collection. I spent a day reinforcing the door, installing a new, heavy-duty lock and concealing the entrance with strategically placed brush. As an additional precaution, I created several duplicate sets of the most successful varieties, storing them in different locations, some at Harold's farm, some with other trusted allies, and some in a safe deposit box at the local bank. Professor Chen helped me document everything in the vault, creating a detailed inventory of each variety, along with digital scans of my great-grandfather's journals. These records were backed up to secure cloud storage and shared with the seed sovereignty. Alliance, if anything happens to the physical seeds, Professor Chen assured me, we at least have the knowledge preserved, and with each harvest you're creating new seed stock adapted to current conditions. Indeed, As August progressed, my heritage crops began reaching maturity, producing not just food, but a new generation of seeds. I dedicated time each day to proper seed-saving techniques, carefully selecting from the best plants and documenting their characteristics. The seed inventory grew steadily, each variety representing both a link to the past and insurance for the future. While securing the physical seeds, I also took steps to protect the knowledge they represented. Working with the Seed Sovereignty Alliance, I began hosting weekend workshops on heritage farming methods. Dozens of local farmers attended, many skeptical at first, but increasingly interested as they toured my flourishing fields. I shared what I had learned from my great-grandfather's journals: companion planting strategies, natural pest management, soil-building techniques, and seed-saving methods. These workshops attracted attention beyond the farming community. Local media covered them extensively. Environmental groups sent representatives. Even a few agricultural extension agents attended, though they maintained professional skepticism about methods that contradicted conventional wisdom. The growing public interest provided a form of protection through visibility. As Nathan Collins, the environmental journalist who had written about my farm, pointed out, the more people who know about your work, the harder it is for Agricon to shut it down quietly. Public opinion becomes your shield. This strategy was put to the test in late August, when Agricon filed a formal complaint with the State Agricultural Board, alleging that my farm posed a biosecurity risk due to unregulated propagation of non-certified seed stock. The complaint demanded mandatory testing of my crops and an immediate cease and desist order pending results. The accusation was technically groundless. Home-saved seeds for personal use or limited local distribution had always been legal, but it triggered an automatic inspection by state agricultural officials. The timing seemed designed to disrupt my harvest and seed-saving operations at their most critical point. When the inspectors arrived, however, they found not just me, but 24 supporters waiting for them: local farmers, food sovereignty activists, and Chef Rebecca with her entire kitchen staff. The media had been alerted as well, with 3 local news teams capturing the proceedings. The lead inspector, a veteran agricultural officer named Johnson, was clearly uncomfortable with the audience. He explained that the inspection was routine and required by law following a formal complaint. "We understand," I said, handing him a thick folder. "That's why we've prepared comprehensive documentation of every variety being grown, along with their historical provenance and certification that none are genetically modified organisms." The folder, prepared with help from Professor Chen and the Alliance's legal team, included photographs, growth records, and historical documentation for each heritage variety. It also contained a detailed legal brief asserting my right to grow and save these seeds under both state and federal law. Inspector Johnson reviewed the materials carefully, occasionally conferring with his colleagues. After a thorough examination of both the documentation and the fields themselves, he reached a conclusion that clearly surprised him. "Everything appears to be in order," he announced. "These varieties qualify as traditional open-pollinated heirlooms exempt from current certification requirements. The biosecurity concern is deemed unfounded." The gathered supporters broke into applause. The news cameras captured the inspector's verdict and the celebratory reaction. By evening, the story had spread across social media and regional news outlets. Heritage seeds vindicated state officials' clear historical farming methods. It was a public relations disaster for Agricon and a victory for our cause. But as Harold reminded me later that night, it was unlikely to be Agricon's last attempt. They've tried legal pressure. They've tried regulatory pressure. They've tried surveillance, he said soberly. Be ready for more direct measures. What you're protecting isn't just seeds, It's a threat to their entire business model. His warning proved prophetic sooner than either of us expected. 3 days after the inspection, I awoke to the sound of my dog barking frantically. Looking out my bedroom window in the pre-dawn darkness, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Flames rising from the direction of my experimental fields. I grabbed my phone and a flashlight, rushing outside in my pajamas and work boots. The night air carried the acrid smell of smoke and something chemical. As I raced toward the experimental fields, I called 911, reporting a fire on my property with desperate urgency. Drawing closer, I could see that the flames were concentrated in one corner of the heritage corn plot. The fire wasn't spreading rapidly, but its very existence was horrifying. This was my most successful planting, nearly ready for harvest, with dozens of rare varieties my great-grandfather had preserved. When I reached the burning section, I discovered something odd. This wasn't a wildfire or accidental blaze. Specific plants had been doused with some kind of accelerant and deliberately ignited. The pattern was too precise, too targeted to be random. Most telling of all, the affected area included only plants I had documented as showing exceptional drought resistance. I started fighting the fire with the garden hose from the nearest spigot, focusing on containing the spread while waiting for the volunteer fire department to arrive. The flames weren't extensive. Whoever had done this had been careful to create a controlled burn rather than a wildfire that might spread to neighboring properties. They wanted to destroy specific crops, not cause a regional emergency that would bring intense scrutiny. By the time the fire trucks arrived, I had managed to contain the worst of it. Chief Ramirez, who headed the volunteer department, surveyed the damage with a professional eye. This wasn't an accident, he concluded, examining the burn pattern. Someone targeted specific areas, and I'm smelling some kind of petroleum accelerant. He nodded grimly. I know who did it, but proving it will be another matter. As firefighters ensured the last embers were extinguished, I checked my game cameras. One had captured grainy night footage of 2 figures in dark clothing moving methodically through my fields approximately 40 minutes before I discovered the fire. They worked with practiced efficiency, focusing on specific areas I had highlighted during recent tours and workshops, the plants showing the most promising drought-resistant traits. Deputy Garcia arrived as I was reviewing the footage. She watched it twice, her expression serious. It's clearly deliberate, but the video quality isn't good enough to identify the perpetrators, she said. We can't see faces or any identifying marks, but this changes the situation from trespassing to criminal damage to property, possibly even arson. We'll open a full investigation. As dawn broke, I surveyed the damage with a heavy heart. About 20% of my heritage corn was destroyed, specifically plants from varieties showing the most remarkable drought tolerance. The loss wasn't just financial, it was a blow to agricultural heritage. Some of these varieties might have existed nowhere else. When Harold arrived an hour later, having heard about the fire from another farmer, his weathered face darkened with anger as he walked the charred rows. This is corporate sabotage, pure and simple, he said, kneeling to examine a burned plant. They're targeting the varieties that most directly challenge their business model. But we can't prove Agricon's involvement, I pointed out. Not legally, Harold conceded. But the timing is too perfect to be coincidence, right after your victory with the agricultural inspectors, and targeting only the most promising drought-resistant varieties. As word of the attack spread, supporters began arriving at the farm. Martin Ramirez brought his sons and extra harvesting equipment. We'll help you salvage what's undamaged, he offered. The more viable seed we can save, the less they've accomplished. Professor Chen arrived with 2 graduate students, bringing specialized equipment to test for chemical residues. We need to document everything scientifically, she insisted. If these plants were targeted because of their specific traits, that's evidence of motive. By mid-morning, My farm had become a hive of activity. Volunteers harvesting undamaged corn, collecting soil samples from the burned areas, and installing additional security cameras. The Seed Sovereignty Alliance sent representatives who helped identify which varieties had been targeted and which had survived unscathed. Local news teams arrived by noon, broadcasting live from my fields. Nathan Collins, the environmental journalist who had championed my story, conducted interviews with volunteers and agricultural experts about the significance of what had been lost and what was being done to protect what remained. This is more than an attack on one farmer's crops, Collins emphasized in his broadcast. It's an attack on our agricultural heritage and food sovereignty. These heritage seeds represent generations of agricultural knowledge that belongs to all of us. The media coverage brought unexpected attention from state officials. By afternoon, representatives from the State Attorney General's office arrived, explaining that they were investigating potential violations of agricultural terrorism statutes. The deliberate destruction of crop research had been specifically criminalized following previous incidents involving corporate agriculture disputes. As the day progressed, my shock and grief gradually transformed into determination. The attack had destroyed some plants, but not the knowledge they represented. The seed vault remained secure. Many mature plants had already been harvested, their seeds safely stored, and I had shared seeds and methods with dozens of other farmers, creating a distributed network that couldn't be eliminated by burning a single field. Around sunset, as most volunteers were heading home, Dr. Montgomery's black SUV pulled into my driveway. She approached alone, her usual composure slightly strained, as she noted the news vans and official vehicles still present. "Mr. Reeves," she began, "I've just learned about the fire on your property. Agricon wants to express our sincere concern and assure you that we had absolutely nothing to do with this deplorable act." "Really?" I couldn't keep the skepticism from my voice. "Your company has been trying to acquire my heritage seeds by any means possible. When legal pressure failed, when regulatory complaints failed, suddenly my most valuable varieties are deliberately destroyed. That's quite a coincidence." Dr. Montgomery's expression tightened. "Agricon operates within legal and ethical boundaries, Mr. Reeves. We're a publicly traded company with a reputation to protect. Corporate sabotage would be not only illegal but catastrophically damaging to our brand. Then who would benefit from destroying these specific plants?" I challenged. "Who would even know which varieties to target? It's not like I label them in the field." She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "The agricultural world has many players with competing interests. Activism can sometimes take extreme forms. Perhaps someone wanted to create exactly this situation, suspicion directed at a visible corporate entity." I almost laughed at the absurdity. "You're suggesting environmental activists burned my heritage crops, the very plants they've been fighting to protect." "I'm merely pointing out that appearances can be deceiving," she replied smoothly. "Regardless, Agricon would like to offer assistance in recovering from this unfortunate incident. Our laboratories have extensive seed preservation capabilities that could help stabilize any damaged varieties." The audacity was breathtaking. "You want me to hand over seeds from the very plants someone just tried to destroy? To put the remaining heritage genetics in your company's control? We're offering professional conservation resources," Dr. Montgomery insisted. "Your homegrown preservation methods are admirable but limited. Agricon can provide controlled conditions, genetic sequencing, and long-term viability testing." Before I could respond, Sofia Garcia from the Seed Sovereignty Alliance joined, us having overheard the conversation. "Mr. Reeves has access to professional seed preservation resources through our network of community seed banks," she interjected. including university partnerships for any necessary genetic analysis. Dr. Montgomery barely acknowledged Sophia's presence. My offer stands, Mr. Reeves. Agricon is still interested in a mutually beneficial resolution to our situation. Perhaps today's unfortunate events will encourage you to reconsider the value of professional stewardship of these genetic resources. As she walked back to her SUV, Sophia turned to me with a grim expression. That wasn't an offer of help. It was an escalation. They're using the fire as leverage, hoping you'll surrender the seeds out of fear of losing more. I know, I said quietly, but they've miscalculated. This attack doesn't make me want to give up. It makes me more determined than ever to protect what my great-grandfather preserved. That night, after the last reporters and volunteers had left, I sat on my porch looking out at the farm. Parts of the experimental field were now blackened and destroyed. The months of work and generations of agricultural heritage reduced to ash. But around the damaged sections, the remaining heritage crops stood tall in the moonlight. Their resilience, a testament to the wisdom embedded in their genetics. The attack had been meant to demoralize me, to demonstrate my vulnerability and push me towards surrendering the seed collection. Instead, it had crystallized my resolve and galvanized a community of support. The message couldn't have been clearer. What my great-grandfather had preserved was threatening enough to the agricultural status quo that someone would risk criminal charges to destroy it. I turned my attention to the seed vault, now guarded by newly installed security cameras. Within those humble glass jars lay something powerful enough to frighten a multinational corporation. The means for farmers to break free from dependency on patented seeds, proprietary chemicals, and corporate control. My great-grandfather had been right all along. These seeds weren't just plants, they were freedom. As I finally went inside to get some rest, my phone pinged with a message from an unfamiliar number. The text was brief, but stopped me in my tracks. Not all of Agricon supports these tactics. Some of us believe in agricultural diversity. Check the registration records for Midwest Field Solutions, LLC. A friend. I sat down at my computer, suddenly, wide awake, and began searching corporate registration databases. What I discovered would change everything about my understanding of the conflict and open a path forward I hadn't imagined possible. Midwest Field Solutions LLC turned out to be a shell company, but its paper trail was revealing. Public records showed it was incorporated 3 years earlier with initial funding from a venture capital firm called Green Horizon Investments. Further digging revealed that Green Horizon was part of a network of companies ultimately controlled by none other than Dr. James Wilson, the same Agricon chief research officer who had accompanied Dr. Montgomery to my farm. Most interesting of all, Midwest Field Solutions owned patent applications for several drought-resistant crop technologies that differed fundamentally from Agricon's main product line. These patents focused on enhanced root systems and soil microbiome interactions, rather than the genetic modifications Agricon was known for. I shared my findings with Professor Chen the next morning. She reviewed the documents with growing excitement. "This is extraordinary," she said. "Dr. Wilson appears to be running a parallel research program outside Agricon's official channels. And based on these patent applications, he's exploring natural drought resistance mechanisms, very similar to what we're seeing in your heritage varieties." Why would Agricon's chief research officer need a secret company? I wondered. Internal. And politics most likely, Professor Chen suggested. Large agricultural corporations have invested so heavily in genetic modification and chemical-dependent farming that exploring alternatives can be seen as heresy. Dr. Wilson may be hedging his bets, pursuing promising research that doesn't align with Agricon's official strategy. The anonymous text message suddenly made more sense. Someone inside Agricon, possibly Dr. Wilson himself, was uncomfortable with the tactics being used against my farm. The question was, how could I use this information? I didn't have long to ponder this question. The day after the fire, Agricon escalated their campaign dramatically. Full-page advertisements appeared in local and regional newspapers with the headline, "Food Safety Alert, Unregulated Seed Operations Threaten Agricultural Standards." While the ads never mentioned me by name, they warned about amateur seed producers operating outside established safety protocols and the risks of untested crop varieties entering the food system. They emphasized Agricon's commitment to rigorous testing and scientific validation of all their products, implying that alternatives were inherently dangerous. Simultaneously, a website appeared called Heritage Seed Truths, purporting to be a consumer information resource, but clearly designed to raise fears about non-commercial seed sources. The site featured ominous warnings about allergens, toxins, and contamination risks, supposedly associated with heirloom vegetables. The media blitz was accompanied by a more direct attack. Several local grocery stores and restaurants that had been carrying my produce received letters from a consumer food safety coalition, later traced to a law firm frequently employed by Agricon, warning of potential liability issues from selling non-commercially certified produce. The pressure tactics worked on some buyers. 3 grocery stores cancelled their orders, and even Chef Rebecca called with concerns about potential impacts on her restaurant. "My lawyer is nervous about these liability claims," she explained. "I know it's just intimidation, but I need to protect my business. Can you provide any documentation about safety testing for these varieties?" It was a reasonable request, but revealed how effective Agricon's strategy was. They had shifted the narrative from celebration of rediscovered heritage crops to fears about safety and regulation, areas where a small farm like mine couldn't easily compete with corporate resources. The Seed Sovereignty Alliance helped me fight back with a hastily organized Heritage Harvest Festival on my farm the following weekend. Hundreds of supporters attended, sampling dishes prepared by Chef Rebecca and other culinary allies using my heritage produce. Local doctors and nutritionists gave presentations about the health benefits of diverse, naturally grown vegetables. Agricultural historians discussed the cultural significance of preserving crop diversity. The festival generated positive media coverage that helped counter Agricon's fear campaign. But the most significant development came from an unexpected direction. Dr. James Wilson requested a private meeting. His message, delivered through Professor Chen, specified neutral territory, a coffee shop in a neighboring town, and emphasized that he was coming alone and unofficially. Wary but intrigued, I agreed, bringing Harold along as both witness and advisor. Dr. Wilson arrived without the corporate polish that had characterized his previous visit to my farm. Dressed in casual clothes rather than a business suit, he appeared tired and slightly nervous, constantly checking his surroundings as if concerned about being recognized. "I want to be clear," he began, after we'd found a private corner of the cafe. "I'm here as a scientist, not as an Agricon representative. What I'm about to discuss directly contradicts my employer's official position." He took a deep breath before continuing. "Mr. Reeves, your great-grandfather's seed collection represents precisely the kind of agricultural genetic diversity that we should be preserving and studying, not attempting to control or eliminate." I exchanged surprised glances with Harold. This was not what we had expected from Agricon's chief research officer. "Then why is your company so determined to shut me down?" I asked. Dr. Wilson's expression was pained. "Agricultural corporations like Agricon have built their business models around farmer dependency, patented seeds that can't be legally saved, crops designed to require specific chemical inputs, technology that obsoletes traditional knowledge. Your heritage varieties threaten that model because they demonstrate an alternative that works. The drought resistance, Harold interjected. Exactly, Dr. Wilson nodded. Modern agriculture has approached drought resistance through genetic modification, isolating specific genes and inserting them into commercial varieties. It's expensive, proprietary technology that keeps farmers reliant on seed companies. But your heritage varieties achieve equal or better results through complex, natural adaptations developed over generations. That's why you created Midwest Field Solutions, I said, watching his face carefully. You're researching an alternative approach outside Agricon's official channels. Dr. Wilson couldn't hide his surprise. How did you... He stopped himself, then nodded slowly. Yes. Some of us within Agricon believe the company's exclusive focus on genetic modification and chemical solutions is scientifically and commercially short-sighted. Natural resilience mechanisms like those in your heritage varieties offer a more sustainable path forward. Does Dr. Montgomery know about your side project? Harold asked. Eliza knows I have research interests beyond Agricon's core focus. Dr. Wilson replied carefully, but she's a true believer in the company's approach. She sees alternatives as threats rather than opportunities. And the fire, the fear campaign, the pressure on my customers, I pressed. Do you consider those appropriate tactics? Dr. Wilson looked genuinely distressed. I had no knowledge of the fire until after it happened. As for the media campaign, that's standard corporate strategy when facing a perceived threat. But I don't condone it. That's partly why I'm here. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. Mr. Reeves, I believe there's a better path forward than this destructive conflict. Your heritage varieties and the knowledge in your great-grandfather's journals represent agricultural wisdom we should be preserving, not suppressing. What exactly are you proposing? I asked cautiously. A research partnership, he replied. Not with Agricon, but with Midwest Field Solutions. We could document, test, and validate the drought resistance and other beneficial traits of your heritage varieties. Create a scientific foundation that would make them harder to dismiss as unproven or unsafe. Harold regarded him skeptically. And who would control the results of this research? Who would own the seeds? That's the key difference in our approach, Dr. Wilson insisted. We're proposing an open-source model. Scientific validation without proprietary claims. The varieties would remain in the public domain, accessible to any farmer willing to follow regenerative practices. It was a startling proposal from someone in Dr. Wilson's position. Why would you do this? I asked. You're risking your career at Agricon. Dr. Wilson smiled ruefully. I'm a scientist first, corporate executive second. I've spent 30 years in agricultural research, watching our system become increasingly consolidated and controlled. The results have been concerning. Declining soil health, reduced biodiversity, farmer dependency, ecological damage. He shook his head. There has to be a better way forward. He glanced at his watch and stood abruptly. I've stayed too long already. Consider my proposal. Professor Chen can serve as an intermediary if you wish to proceed. After he left, Harold and I sat in silence, processing the unexpected turn of events. Could be a trap, Harold finally said. A way to get access to your seeds through this shell company. Maybe, I acknowledged, but if it's legitimate, it could provide exactly what we need, scientific validation that would make these varieties harder to dismiss or suppress. Upon returning to the farm, I discovered that Agricon's pressure campaign had intensified. An anonymous caller had reported me to the health department for selling untested food products, triggering a mandatory inspection. Online reviews for my farmer's market stand had been flooded with suspicious negative comments raising food safety concerns. Several more grocery stores had cancelled their orders. Most alarmingly, I received notice that Agricon had filed a formal legal complaint alleging that my heritage varieties showed suspicious genetic similarity to their proprietary drought-resistant corn, implying patent infringement, an absurd claim given that my great-grandfather had preserved these seeds decades before Agricon existed. The legal notice included a demand for immediate surrender of all seed stock for independent testing and cessation of all growing activities pending resolution of the complaint. They're escalating because you're winning. Sophia from the seed. Sovereignty Alliance told me when I called for advice. The fire didn't work. The regulatory pressure didn't work. Now they're trying to bury you in legal proceedings they know you can't afford to fight. Her analysis was accurate. While the Alliance could provide some legal support, a prolonged court battle against Agricon's resources would drain my limited finances and divert attention from the farm itself. It was a war of attrition I couldn't win alone. That evening, as I walked through the partially damaged fields, I came to a decision. The heritage seeds couldn't be protected by keeping them isolated on my farm. Their future and my great-grandfather's legacy depended on broader distribution and scientific documentation that would make suppression impossible. I needed allies with resources and expertise to match Agricon's. Dr. Wilson's proposal, whatever its risks, offered a path forward that aligned with my goals. But I would proceed with caution, maintaining control of the original seed vault while engaging in limited collaboration. What I didn't realize was that Agricon had anticipated this move, and Dr. Montgomery was already implementing a contingency plan that would target not just my farm, but everyone connected to the heritage seed network I had built. The morning after my meeting with Dr. Wilson, I awoke to a flurry of phone calls from farmers who had received heritage seeds from me. Each reported the same disturbing development: cease and desist letters from Agricon, threatening legal action if they didn't destroy all plants and seeds from my great-grandfather's collection. It was a coordinated attack designed to isolate my farm and eliminate all satellite growing operations. By mid-morning, the Seed Sovereignty Alliance had mobilized their legal team, but as Marco Rodriguez explained, legal battles would take months or years, time we didn't have with harvest approaching. What Agricon didn't realize was that their aggressive tactics had crossed a line that would backfire spectacularly. Martin Ramirez, facing the prospect of destroying his thriving test plot, instead called his cousin who worked at the regional news station. By noon, TV crews were filming farmers reading their cease and desist letters aloud, standing beside healthy crops that had survived the drought while conventional fields withered. The visual contrast was undeniable. Heritage plots remained green and productive without irrigation, while surrounding conventional crops struggled despite intensive watering. No corporate messaging could counter the simple evidence growing in those fields. Nathan Collins, the environmental journalist who had been following my story, published an explosive investigative piece connecting Agricon to the fire on my farm. While circumstantial, the evidence was compelling enough for the state attorney general to announce a formal investigation into potential corporate sabotage and agricultural terrorism. The public narrative shifted dramatically. What had been my personal struggle became a symbol of resistance against corporate control of our food system. Social media exploded with support. Heritage Seeds and Save Our Seeds began trending. Crowdfunding campaigns sprang up to help farmers fight Agricon's legal threats. The tipping point came 3 days later when Dr. James Wilson held a press conference that stunned the agricultural world. Flanked by Professor Chen and several respected agricultural scientists, he publicly resigned from Agricon and revealed that the company had suppressed internal research showing the superior drought resistance of heritage varieties. For years, We've known that many pre-war seed varieties contain natural resilience mechanisms that outperform our genetically modified products in drought conditions, he stated. This information was deliberately withheld because it contradicted the company's business model of farmer dependency on patented seeds and chemical inputs. Dr. Wilson announced that Midwest Field Solutions would become a non-profit research organization dedicated to documenting, preserving, and distributing heritage seed varieties as open-source agricultural resources. He invited farmers nationwide to participate in a distributed research network that would put these seeds beyond any single corporation's control. Agricon's stock plummeted. Their legal offensive crumbled in the face of public outrage and Dr. Wilson's testimony. The Attorney General's investigation expanded to include potential corporate espionage and anti-competitive practices. Internal documents leaked by whistleblowers revealed a systematic campaign to suppress heritage seed varieties that threatened their market dominance. 2 weeks after Dr. Wilson's press conference, Dr. Montgomery appeared unannounced at my farm. Gone was the corporate confidence that had characterized her previous visits. She seemed smaller somehow, diminished by recent events. Agricon is withdrawing all legal actions related to your heritage varieties, she stated flatly. The company will be pursuing a different direction regarding drought-resistant technologies. Different how? I asked. The board has authorized a new research initiative focused on natural drought resistance mechanisms, she replied with visible reluctance. We'll be examining heritage varieties as potential sources for conventional breeding programs rather than genetic modification approaches. The irony wasn't lost on me. After trying to destroy my great-grandfather's agricultural legacy, Agricon was now being forced to acknowledge its value. Not out of ethical considerations, but because public opinion and market forces had left them. No choice. Dr. Montgomery hesitated before adding, "For what it's worth, not everyone at Agricon supported the tactics used against your farm. Some of us genuinely believe in agricultural innovation. We just disagreed about what constitutes progress." As she turned to leave, I called after her. The seeds were never meant to be controlled by any single person or company. My great-grandfather preserved them for everyone. She paused, then nodded slowly before walking away. The following spring marked a new beginning. With legal threats removed and public support secured, the Heritage Seed Network flourished. Over 500 farmers across the Midwest planted test plots using my great-grandfather's varieties, coordinated through Dr. Wilson's Research Foundation. Professor Chen led the scientific documentation, creating an open-source database of performance metrics, growing methods, and seed-saving techniques. My own farm expanded the heritage fields to 40 acres, replacing most of my conventional crops. Chef Rebecca's restaurant now featured a heritage harvest menu that had earned national recognition, creating premium markets for these forgotten flavors. The Seed Sovereignty Alliance established a formal seed bank to ensure these varieties would never again face extinction. Most meaningful to me was the completion of the Heritage Agricultural Center we built on my property, a hands-on educational facility where farmers, students, and researchers could learn the integration of traditional wisdom with modern science. At its heart stood a replica of my great-grandfather's concrete vault, displaying the original seed jars and journals alongside the thriving fields their contents had produced. On the day we dedicated the center, Harold pulled me aside, his weathered face contemplative as he gazed across fields now bursting with biodiversity. "Your great-grandfather built that vault because he feared this knowledge might be lost," he said. "He couldn't have imagined it would not only survive, but flourish like this." I nodded, watching families tour the demonstration gardens, children marveling at strange-shaped tomatoes and multicolored corn varieties their grandparents had grown but their parents had never seen. The most important thing we've preserved isn't just the seeds, I replied. It's the understanding that farming can work with nature instead of trying to control it. That's what really threatened Agricon, not the specific varieties, but the entire philosophy they represent. As the sun set over fields that had nearly been lost to corporate control, I felt my great-grandfather's presence in every plant that stretched toward the darkening sky. He had buried a treasure during America's darkest agricultural crisis, not for himself, but for future generations who would need to remember what he already knew, that the wisdom of the past, combined with the knowledge of the present, offered the surest path to a resilient future. The seeds had slept for nearly a century, waiting for their moment to grow again. Now they were awake and spreading, carrying with them not just genetic diversity, but a message about independence, resilience, and the enduring power of agricultural heritage to sustain us through whatever challenges the future might bring.